Hey everybody, my name is Sam and I'm the videographer here at Empire Digital. Normally I'm on that side of the camera, but today I'm stepping in front to talk to you guys a little bit about what it's like to film in a studio environment and some tips and tricks on how to set up and just the basics of what it's like filming in a studio. And just quickly before we get started, I'd like to talk about some of the benefits of filming in a studio because perhaps some of you haven't done that before. Perhaps you've only filmed on set for short films or on location if you've gone to see clients where they're based. So there could be some real changes when it comes to filming in a studio based compared to some of those things. So one of the big changes and one of the big benefits is that you have complete control over all of the elements in a studio. You don't have to worry about external factors like weather or sound. You have access to everything and you can change everything accordingly. You don't have to worry about if you're filming outside and the weather completely changes and the lighting is completely different from one shot to the next and you have to spend lots of time adjusting your lights. In the studio, you have control over all of that. You don't have to worry about the lighting changing because the room isn't changing. Same with the sound. There won't be any external sound if you have a decent microphone. So there can be some really, really big benefits of filming in a studio. And also, when I say studio, I don't necessarily mean a really expensive studio that you have to rent with really expensive equipment that you have to hire. A studio can be a big enough room in a house or an office or anywhere really that you have access to. If you have a couple of lights and a camera, then you can set up a pretty decent studio. So now that we talked about some of the benefits of filming in the studio, I'm going to talk about the three sort of main elements that you need to worry about when you're in the studio, those being the camera, the lights, and the sound. And that's pretty basic for any filming setup. I will briefly talk about the green screen. I'm pointing behind me because it is behind me, although you can't see that. I will briefly talk about the green screen, but I think there's enough there for an entire video in itself because there could be some really complicated details when it comes to filming on the green screen. So we will save that, but I will briefly mention it. So let's start by talking about the camera. So the camera, what are some of the things that you need to look out for when you're filming in a studio with a camera? They're basic things and they don't make a huge difference to the overall setup, but it's something to look out for and it's a very, very basic thing. So the first thing is where your camera is placed in comparison to your subject. So what I mean by this is your camera level? Is your camera in the right eye line with your subject? It's a very, very important thing because the subject is the main focus of what you're filming in a studio for the most part. But when I say subject, I don't necessarily mean the person that you're filming. I also mean the product or whatever it is that you're filming in the studio, they are the focus. So your camera needs to be level, and there's really, really simple ways that you can do this. There's normally a spirit level on the tripod that you're using. There should be on most tripods, and make sure that that spirit level is in the center so that that makes sure that your camera is level on the tripod. And then once you've done that, all you need to do is raise the tripod so that the eye line of your subject is within the eye line of the camera, of the lens. And there's a couple of things that you can do to make sure that's the case. There will be levels, meters on the digital camera as well that you can turn on in the settings. And this just makes sure that your subject looks good. It's as simple as that. If the camera is pointing up towards the subject or down towards the subject, that can really affect the size of the subject in the frame. And it can give a weird distorted look, which isn't really what you want for the kind of filming that you're doing in a studio. It might be, and obviously if that's the case, then you know that. But for the most part, you want them to look as they appear in the real world. So keep the camera level, keep it in the eye line of your subject, and keep the tripod level with the camera. Now, the next thing you need to worry about is the shutter speed. When I say worry about, it's not really a worry. It's a very, very simple part of filming and one of the first things that you check when you set up your camera. But I just want to briefly mention it because your subject isn't moving so much in the frame. They might be coming in and out of frame or walking across the green screen, but for the most part, your subject is going to be still, especially if you're filming a product. And that being the case, you don't normally have to worry too much about the shutter speed. The shutter speed being level with how fast your subject is moving. So if you keep it at 50, that should be fine for a subject that's doing pretty much what I'm doing now, which is standing and talking to you. Next, I want to briefly touch on the white balance. So the white balance is obviously something that if you've filmed with a camera before, you've obviously done. And if you haven't, that's fine. It's a very, very simple thing. White balance is just making sure that the color of the frame and the white of the frame is the same as it is in the location that you're filming in. So obviously this changes depending on the location, but for the studio, once you've got your lights set up, you know the white balance. So all you need to do is get a white piece of paper, a sheet of A4 is fine, place it where your subject is. So if I was doing it here, I'd place my white sheet of paper here, and then go to your camera and go into the settings and go into white balance and set the white balance manually rather than automatically. Set the white balance manually to the piece of paper that you have in front of you. That will then change the settings in the camera so that the white balance of the room is now the white balance of the camera. That just makes everything much easier when you're setting up your lights and you're making your subject look nice and well lit. It just gives a natural look to your subject. And it's a very, very important thing. So there's just a few things there with the camera. The camera isn't something that you really have to worry about too much when you're filming because, like I said, you don't really have to control the elements too much. But once you've done those few key things with the camera, that's it. Simple as that. So now let's talk about the lighting. So lighting. What are some of the basics of lighting in a film studio? Well, they're kind of the basics of lighting anywhere. It just so happens that when you're in a film studio, things are slightly easier. So I'll just cover the basics of lighting and what a lighting setup is. Now, for the most part, when you're in a studio and when you're on set, it's the same. You have a 3-point lighting setup. And those 3 points are 3 different lights. So you have your key light, your fill light, and your backlight. Now this changes depending on what shot you're using or which camera you're using or the environment that you're filming in, but when you're in a studio, you know that those things don't normally change. So the lighting setup normally stays the same. So let's go through each of those points of the lighting setup. So the key light is the most important light. This is the light number 1, that lights your subject the most. This is the one that you have facing your subject, not necessarily directly, because if you face the light directly onto your subject, it casts shadows kind of coming this way, and that can look quite odd. But if you have your key light just to the left or just to the right of your subject, depending on where you want your shadows to be, then that is the light that gives them the illumination. The fill light, light number 2, is also very important because the fill light does exactly that. It fills out the shadows that have been cast by your key light. If you're filming in a studio, for the most part, you probably want your subject to be lit well and to not have too many harsh shadows because that's more of a kind of filming creative sort of thing if you're doing a film that uses shadows in a creative way. But if you're just filming a subject talking, you want them to be lit as well as possible. So the fill light fills in those shadows and gets rid of any harshness in the image. And the backlight is the final light in that 3-point setup. The backlight is really, really simple. It's just a light towards the back of the subject from either side. You don't want it directly behind your subject because then you'll see it on camera. But the backlight just casts a nice light, a sort of a ring of light around the edge of the subject, which just gives them that sort of warm cinematic look. It's very, very popular in film lighting. But the backlight can cause some problems if you're filming in a studio. For example, if you have something behind your subject, like a green screen, then you can't necessarily put a light right behind your subject. But that's okay. You can put some lights towards the side of the green screen to bounce some shadows off, and you still get to create a nice sort of warm look regardless. So those are the 3 points, the 3-point lighting setup. Very, very important and very, very basic. And once you've got those right in your studio, you don't have to move them. So that's great. The next thing is your color temperature and the intensity of the lights. Now this is something that you want to focus on if you're using LED panels, especially because these controls are really, really simple and really, really easy to use. Now this can get more complicated and more in depth if you're using an LED panel that has RGB controls, which is the red, green and blue controls, and that gives the light an actual color, a color from the rainbow. So that's more if you're, again, trying to be a bit more creative with your video production. You'll have the adjustments of each of those, and if you turn more red, then your light becomes more red, more green, and then it pulls those colors back. So essentially that's a case of playing around and seeing what works for you and seeing what kind of color you want. But if you have a more basic LED panel, that's also fine, and that might be all you need for filming your subject on the green screen or wherever they are in the studio. So what you have is you have your intensity, which is exactly that. It is a dial that adjusts the amount the light is shown. So intensity up to 100 is the light at full beam, and then intensity down to 0 is the light pretty much off. Now you just want to adjust it to get the light right for you. I think normally somewhere around 70 to 100 is good. You don't want it too dim because the whole point is you're trying to light your subject, but you don't want it too high. If you've got the light closer, it can almost overexpose the subject. So just adjust those light levels and see what works for you. The color temperature, again, is another one that you want to adjust when you're in the studio and when you've got your subject in position. The color temperature isn't the color like the RGB controls, it's not the color of the rainbow that your light turns. The color temperature is the actual temperature of the light. So this can be anywhere from 3000 Kelvin up to 6000 Kelvin. It really depends on what light you have, but it's essentially the higher your Kelvin go, the colder the light becomes. And the lower the Kelvin is, the warmer it becomes. So if you have a low Kelvin down in the 3000 mark, that can create a really, really sort of orange warm glow. It might be too orange down there, and then up past 5000 you start to get a bluer looking light, a colder looking light. So you can adjust this depending on what lighting effects you want to have in your studio. I think if you want to go for a simple recreation of natural light, then somewhere around 4000 is a good mark. 4200 is a nice mark. It's not too warm, but it's not too cold. That's a nice middle ground. And then you can kind of go from there, adjusting as you like. So that's it. Those are some of the very, very basic points in lighting setups in a studio. You want to focus on your 3-point lighting, you want to check the color temperature, and you want to check the intensity. That's really it. Again, there's more things that we can go into detail in later videos, like the positioning of the lights based on the distance from your subject, but these are really things that you can kind of adjust when you get into the studio. It's mainly those 3 things that you want to look out for when you set up and when you start. So now that we talked about lights, let's go on to sound recording.